this webinar, The Power of Position Profiles. I'm sure that everybody that's attending this call today, this webinar, you're using position profiles today, you're thinking about using position profiles, or perhaps maybe you're using the position profiles and you're experiencing some type of challenge with that. And that challenge can certainly be, how do I create a position profile? Or what does this even mean? Or more importantly, what will be addressed through this webinar is, how can I facilitate more buy-in? How can I attract more buy-in from the key stakeholders who are part of the recruiting and selection process? That could be the manager of the person who's responsible for that job. It could be a hiring manager, or it could be anyone that's part of the recruiting and selection process. Today's focus is going to be primarily for you to leave this webinar with more confidence in utilizing position profiles. So that's going to be around better understanding of the key drivers of the job and why they matter. We're also going to talk about the significance of the gap. So when there is a match deficit, when there's a gap between the applicant's profile and the position profile, how significant is that? What does that mean? And then finally, we're also going to talk about gaining more inclusion and buy-in around the position profiles. And it's a very simple process that I'm going to share with you that we've done several times, and also it's a best practice that's being done with many of our other users. And it does involve using what you currently have today and just making some minor modifications to that, which then does attract more buy-in from the key stakeholders in recruiting and selection. But again, more importantly, is you leaving today's webinar with more confidence in using position profiles. And it doesn't end here. You can reach out to your consultant. We can continue to have discussions. We can help you focus on how to build that position profile and how to gain more buy-in as well. Now, throughout this webinar, if you have any questions, notice that you're on mute. You can feel free to use the chat icon as well. Leslie is with us and is hosting this webinar, and she is going to moderate and screen any chats or any questions, and then certainly interrupt me if you do have that question, and I'll try my best to answer. Where I would like to start is the so what. Why is this topic even important? And the first part of this, many of you, all of you are probably already aware of, and you've probably seen this, especially from a SHRM perspective, in regards to the cost of a mismatch. Then there's also, when we continue to use traditional methods, when we're not relying on any type of objective tool or a tool that's bringing more objectivity to the match or focusing on job fit, and if we're just relying purely on the traditional methods, as you can see here, you're probably already familiar with this as well. And the entire point of a position profile is to set a target for where we want to be. This quote from Lewis Carroll, and you've probably heard this quote, maybe from me if you've been in one of my trainings, or Alice in Wonderland as well. This quote is referenced. So if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Now, this quote certainly sounds like it could be positive, I suppose, in regards to there's a lot of creativity that we can employ to get where we want to be. But when it comes to looking for that right fit, we want to make sure that we have a target on where we want to be, because what that target's going to do is it's going to help clarify a gap. And this gap is going to help us prevent bad decisions. It's going to help us anticipate what we need to prepare for when it comes to making up for that deficit. And then, of course, it's going to help us prepare for that, whether that's resources that we need from others or technical resources that can help compensate for that missing item or that missing skill that's necessary for that job. Because inevitably what happens is when there is a match deficit, when there's a gap, it creates the need for external intervention. And what this means is when resources are devoted to compensate for the absence of a necessary skill or strength. That intervention, again, can be the manager has to do more work. The manager has to be more hands-on versus focusing on their own key responsibilities. So this costs time, money's involved, resources that you didn't originally anticipate. And that gap presents a lot of opportunity for more learning around how can we fine-tune this position profile so we can prevent this in the future if it were to happen again. And where I want to start to help simplify the importance of this is with a real experience, a very recent experience with a manager that I'm working with. Now, this position profile is for a project manager. This is a project manager's position profile. High A, highest B, lowest C, and the D drive is high. Now, you could have project managers as well, and those position profiles could be slightly different. But this position profile was created for this organization based on their needs. Now, the manager that's overseeing this position is high A, lowest B, low C, very close to the line, and highest D. The two individuals that they have as project managers are very similar. And you can see there's a lot of consistency, in fact, between the project management position profile and the project managers that are currently employed, with the only difference being that D drive. Both current project managers are generalist profiles, so the A is greater than the D. That's a great match. Both are high B, which was important to this particular manager because they wanted them to connect with the teams within their region effectively. And then certainly both are low C profiles, B greater than A as well, that combination. The difference is the D drive. The D drive for the position profile is high, whereas for the two project managers are low. And at this time, this manager in particular wasn't fully on board with the position profile. These two individuals, the PM1 and PM2, just interviewed really well. And they happened to have a pretty good match with the position profile, as you'll see on this next slide. In fact, it's a 90% match for the position profiles. We would tell anyone you would certainly want to focus and you'd want an interview on these individuals. But also mind the gap. Even though it's a 10 percentage point decrease, you should still mind that and think about what's going to be required when it comes to covering that gap. Again, that external intervention that happens. Notice with the manager's profile that D drive is high. So although they base a lot of this on the necessary skills of a project manager, but they're also looking at, we want to make sure that these individuals are working well with the team. I'm not going to worry so much from the manager's perspective. This manager saying, I'm not going to worry so much about the lower D side. As long as they connect with the team, 90%, this is a good situation to be in. Now, what started to happen over time is this particular manager started to have some challenges with both of these individuals, having to constantly follow up and remind them. Did result in doubling the training costs for PM training and software. Started to second guess and lose trust over updates and progress towards goals. Project status updates went from twice a week to twice a month to one, sometimes twice a week. And then spent way too much time reviewing and editing their emails. Now, a lot of that comes down to the manager's expectations and their own standards around that perfectionistic tendency that often comes with highest D profiles. And even though this is a 10 percentage point deficit, it's a 90% match, absolutely somebody you should consider hiring and interviewing, and then doing a good job in many other areas. But what does that deficit of 10 percentage point mean? It means for this manager that there's coaching for this manager, and that was the intervention. Now, certainly some of that PM training, which has helped over a long period of time, and then the coaching for the manager has certainly helped as well. And thankfully, that's all completed. These two individuals are thriving because of the coaching that manager is receiving in mitigating some of the intensity that they show around their need for their standards and that perfectionistic side of that highest D profile. But imagine if that deficit was greater than 90%. What if it was 30? What if it was 50% or 60% deficit? So as that increases, so does the need for the intervention. And the goal is to make sure that that job is conducive to the natural strengths of the profile. When the job is not conducive to the natural strengths of the profile or natural wiring, then what's going to happen, it's going to exploit where that profile is less effective. And then certainly you have to think about the manager's profile or the culture in general, the people that they're relying on to be successful. There's a lot of opportunity for a bad fit to be easily exploited, which then leads to the need for a lot of external motivation, which then takes a lot of time. It can be very costly. Even at a 10 percentage point decrease, that manager put in a lot of work to train and then certainly for their own self-awareness to decrease their level of expectation when it comes to slightly misspelled words, things like that, as long as the message was getting across. Now, when we think of jobs, we think of 4 key drivers, and these key drivers are pace. Every job is going to have a required pace. Sometimes this job is going to call for somebody and benefit from somebody that moves quickly, that has this natural sense of urgency, or is more processed and more methodical. Every job is going to require some decision making. Now, some of that decision making is going to come down to minding the details, dotting I's and crossing T's, measuring twice, cutting once, and all those adages related to being that specialist profile where you're in the weeds and you have to be comfortable with that before making the decision, versus the decisions that are a little more abstract, that are a little more general, where you got to focus more on that outcome, making the fast decisions without getting caught up into the weeds. Then, of course, some jobs, all jobs are going to call upon the need for somebody to be more socially focused or more task focused. And then finally, yes, we have to consider that response level. How easy is it for them to be engaged with their environment or to be stimulated? Is it okay to be in a job to be a little chilled out? Or is it a job that's going to require you to be a lot more engaged with your environment? Now, this process, what we refer to as scaling performance, involves controlled and measurable variables between jobs and people to ensure predictable performance and productivity. The operative word here is predictable. So if we can control these factors, these 4 key drivers, and we can create a position profile based on those key drivers, and then we also are able to capture the AcuMax index of the applicants, that naturally creates a gap that we can then focus on. And then it helps us prevent, it helps us anticipate what we're going to do when we need to hire somebody that's at a 10% and 90% or an 80%, what the resources needed to cover for that gap. And sometimes at a yellow, where that percentage is a little lower but still acceptable, proceeding with caution. Well, what does that even mean, proceed with caution? How do we qualify that? But because we have the target and we have the applicant's profile, then we have a lot more visualization, clarification around what that looks like. But let's take it a step further. Let's continue to refer to the same manager's profile. Now, this manager also has the customer service rep employee, a CSR. Now, there is no position profile at the time of this particular intervention. Now, again, this manager wasn't fully on board with the position profiles. With a 90% match that was worked out for this manager, continues to work out because of the coaching they received. But for this CSR, there was never a position profile until this particular situation, because they started to find that this CSR was struggling in the job in many aspects, but also in some areas doing well. So what we did with this manager is we revisited the roles, responsibilities, and expectations, or responsibilities and tasks. Now, this is something you probably already have with your jobs. And if you don't, you probably should. Now, what we usually don't think about doing is taking a job description or the responsibilities and tasks, or the roles, responsibilities, and expectations, your RREs, and then converting them into a position profile. Now, going from just what you see on the screen here to then just creating a position profile, sure, you can do that, but the goal here is we want to make this a little more inclusive with the manager. We want to involve that manager, which is then going to help with their buy-in. Now, some of this does require more education, not only for you, but also for managers and other key stakeholders that are part of the recruiting and selection process. So they understand the basics of the A, B, C, D. And then also, what is that criteria? What are those 4 key drivers of a position, of your jobs? And having a thorough understanding of that, and then looking at the key responsibilities and tasks a little differently. So taking for the CSR, what are the tasks, the responsibility and the tasks for the CSR? And then adding an additional layer onto this. And this is really what I want you to do with your current jobs, is create an extra column. And that column is AcuMax index drives, where you can then assign AcuMax drives to each task. You can do this on your own. You can do it with the manager. I would recommend doing it with the manager. Might be easy that you start on your own, doing it individually, and then including the manager. What do you think about this task being related to the high B and the low C drive? Now, from assigning the AcuMax index drive drives with the task of the customer service representative position, this then helps you and the manager buy in and create a position profile. So what that position profile for this CSR looks like is what you see on the screen. Now, this will make more sense to the manager because they've taken the time to look at the drives that are assigned with each task. So we know as a CSR, this individual needs to be accommodating and inclusive, expressive, more of a storytelling communication style, the B greater than A, social over task. Also, this person's probably going to have to deal with a lot of interruptions, phone calls, live chats, support tickets, and then more structured and data driven. Now, again, in reference to the current CSR that's working with this organization, they're doing well in some areas, but now we start to have more clarification around the gap between their profile and this profile. And the manager is bought in because she realizes what she had to deal with at a 10% deficit. So she certainly doesn't want to deal with more at a greater deficit. So there's more buy-in from that perspective as well. But it's more than that. So sometimes what you need to do is you need to get back with the manager after you assign these AcuMax index drives with each task and have the manager qualify that, give you an idea of what that means to the manager. So that's exactly what we did. Having the manager look at the AcuMax drives assigned to each task and have them qualify the priority of that. What does it mean to the manager? So for example, responsibility, customer satisfaction. You can see the tasks that are listed there. I'm not going to read all of them on the screen. You can read, but you can see the first one, respond to customer inquiries via phone, email, live chat, and in person in a timely manner. High B, low C. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean for the manager? The manager looks at that and says, well, absolutely, I think customer tickets should be responded to within 24 hours for that manager, which is natural for that manager, the A drive, the C drive being low. So a little more urgency around that, but not a 2-hour type of policy, but 24 hours seems reasonable. Okay, so that seems to me that's a high B, low C trait. So that makes sense. For the second task, we're saying that it's low A, high B, high C because it's process. The manager looks at that and says, sure, if there are talk tracks, scripts should be followed for consistency. And we have those things, and that's good. And thankfully, that particular CSR is doing a good job with that. They're using the scripts. And that is appealing to the higher C nature of that customer service representative, is they can follow that script because it's high C friendly. Then you have the third task, following up with customers to ensure they're satisfied. The manager looks at that and says, yeah, I think part of that is customers should receive a satisfaction survey. So there is some follow-up there. So again, that's low A, high B, high C. For documentation administration, processing orders, forms, and applications and requests. High C, high D. But the manager says some backfill might be needed for new orders, meaning that there are other positions that this CSR might have to backfill sometimes. Now, we wouldn't have known that unless we've taken the moment to sit with that manager to help them qualify some of these tasks and responsibilities. So maybe we look at that and we think, well, is it high C? Can a high C get away with that job? Or is there the need to have a little more of that low C presence? So that may change. We could edit that together with the manager and then maintain customer records for updating account information in the systems. Certainly that's playing to that high C, higher D side of the profile. Tech and support teams should be updated and have easy access to the documentation. And then we go to the last, the product knowledge. Staying up to date with product knowledge, policies, and procedures. Low A, high D. And the manager says, sure, they should have enough product knowledge to create an opportunity for an upsell. So that product knowledge then results in an upsell, which then again, we wouldn't have known that unless we've taken the time to really qualify this. And when we think of upsell, we may look at that and say, that we may need to edit that as well and maybe add low A, high B, and high D. That reliability and product knowledge, taking the time to work with teams to understand the solutions, not necessarily having to be an expert with the solutions, but understanding it enough to create interest and then directing that client to the appropriate party to then create that opportunity for an upsell. So we make an edit there, we throw in the high B, maybe we make an edit for the process order forms and applications because of the backfill, we say maybe it is low C instead of high C. So then you start to see greater presence of low C in that column, certainly the high B as well, B greater than A. Then you start seeing a little more of that low C. But then what really sticks out is that need for the D drive being high. And then what you want to do with the manager is let's just kind of go through this and compare it to your observations around the current CSR's performance. So for example, they're doing a good job here. That's a green check mark. They're doing a good job with that from a high B perspective. Sure, they're high C and we're saying it's a low C side in regards to responding, but they're showing that they have good control over the variety of mediums of communication. They're responding to tickets well. That response time is there. So a lot of that highest B is making up for the lack of low C. They're doing a good job here as well, right? So their customers are happy. They're coming back with, positive customer satisfaction scores, which is nice to have. They're also, when it comes to processing orders, forms, and applications, this is where we start to look at it and say, you know what, that low D is really starting to show in that situation. They're not doing that as well as they need. A little scattered, not as organized they need to be. A lot of that lowest D side of who they are could be showing up. Maintaining customer records, tech support. I'm often hearing from the support teams in regards to outdated documentation that hasn't been updated for particular clients, or usage data on the solutions that are being used. So that low D is showing up there as well. And then of course, sure, from a highest B perspective, but there's a lot of missed opportunities because questions are being asked and this current CSR doesn't really know how to answer it. Or they're telling that particular client, hold on, let me check with the tech team. Let me check with the developers, the ones that have an idea of our roadmap or our current solutions, and then I can get back to you. But then that low D kicks in, maybe becomes very forgetful, or they don't understand it, so it becomes somewhat intimidating to have that conversation. So now what happens is this starts to make sense for the manager. Now I start to see the importance of these drives and how these drives are utilized to then contribute to a position profile. And then what makes more sense is that match, right? So now when you're giving that manager who's been part of that inclusive process of aligning AcuMax index drives to the task and responsibilities, and then to go through the third phase of comparing that to current performance, now it makes sense. Now that manager can sit back and say that 30%, I'm aware and I remember what I had to deal with just a 10% deficit. 30%? That's a problem. That's going to require a lot of intervention. But keep in mind, this person's still doing a good job with many of the tasks. So it's not a matter of termination or even a performance improvement plan. But what it does call for is it does call for a new position profile that we can hire towards. It's going to be a little more focused on upselling and product knowledge. And of course, the customer service and responsiveness that this current CSR is showing. But if you look at the weighting there, right, this begins to make sense for all of us, and certainly for this manager. When we think of pace and work style, that makes up for 40% of that algorithm, of that match. That accounts for the majority of weighting. And the reason why is because when you take a high C profile and you put them into a low C job, that happens to be the hardest drive to fight. Now, a high C going into a low C job or a low C going into a high C job is certainly manageable for a short amount of time. Now, the fuel there is job security, what they're being paid. But over time, that low C and a high C job, they're going to start to think, is this it? Is this the same work that I'm going to be doing for a long time? And then you have that career discussion with them, and then they realize within a year or two, they can be in a different position. That low C is not going to want to wait for that. And then what happens is they start to adjust on the adjusted self. They start to adjust from a low C to a high C, and then what happens is they start to let details fall through the cracks because they become a little more careless, because that natural self starts to leak through a bit. And then that leads to a lot of costly mistakes on the back end. The opposite of that is true as well. That high C profile that's in that low C position. And the thing we forget about high C profiles is when the C drive is high, it's a social drive. It's about being treated as a human being, not as a cog in a machine or an employee number. And I believe that the C drive, when we think about the task orientation or social orientation of every drive, the C drive is probably the most confusing. Because when we think of high Cs, we think of process, we think about steps in a plan, we think about order, button up one task before moving on to the next. Doesn't that sound like task? But it's social. And the reason why it's social, because when we take our time with someone, or if I feel that I'm able to take my time on my job and there's nobody that's breathing down my neck or telling me that I need to move faster, that's humanistic. They're telling me that they're patient with me, that I can be patient with my work. So imagine that low C, or I'm sorry, the high C working in that low C job. Imagine the pain that comes with that. I can never get anything done because I have to move and I have to take care of multiple other types of tasks. Well, why don't you do anything about that? Why should I? Nobody cares about me here. And that's what happens. And then adjusting from high C to low C, which then becomes a lot more painful, by the way, than the low C to the high C. Very hard to fight, which is why it makes it for 40% of the weighting. And if you're doing that, you're playing with fire. You really are, from a C drive perspective. Now, when we start talking about the AD and the AB combo, the AD drive, generalist versus specialist. Now, interesting here, if you go back to the first story I shared with you, that project manager position profile, it's a generalist position profile. The two current project managers are also generalist position profiles. The manager, however, that was the challenge that represented that gap. The manager was a specialist. 90% doing most of the job very well, but it was just the manager who needed the coaching there. So that was the required intervention. That's a lot easier to deal with than it comes to that 30% that you're seeing on the screen here. Now, the AB combination. This gets into that social and task. From both stories, that B is greater than EA, social before task. As a project manager working with their respective regions, social before task. Let's come together, let's discuss the flexibility that's needed in this project. Same thing with the customer service rep, social before task. So that 20% helps to explain that. But again, if it was task over social, we're only talking a 20 percentage point deficit. But what's that going to cost you in regards to accommodating that gap? And then the response level to 10%. So again, all of this begins to make more sense when it comes to position profiles. And because you've included the manager in the process of assigning and aligning the drives to each task and then having them qualify, it gives them that understanding that now when they receive that report based on hire or do not hire, red or green or yellow or orange, then it becomes now this makes sense. And of course, this becomes a lot more appealing to them because now they're putting a little more effort into understanding. We have a current CSR that's doing pretty good, right? We don't have to do anything drastic with them because they're doing the majority of the job okay. But we also want somebody now based on this new position profile that's at 100% match, where if the job itself is conducive to the natural wiring of the profile, that's going to require less external motivation. The job itself becomes the motivator for the person, for, in this case, Maurice Clooney, that's in the job. Lastly, this particular manager going through the hiring process and went through a few interviews. As you can see here, Maurice is part of this at 100% for the CSR. Marco Balboa didn't really interview well, but what happens is this manager looks at these two other individuals, Paul Anderson and Saul Dorado, lower matches at a 50%. So because everything makes sense, she looks at this and says, no, not for CSR, but they really did interview well. And Paul especially has a great resume when it comes to sales. So how can we use these individuals for our future today? Taking your roles, responsibilities, and expectations, and then aligning the AcuMax index drives to that. So this is a process of creating them. If you don't have them, most likely you have them. Revisit or create responsibilities tasks and include the AcuMax index drives. Review that with your managers and other key stakeholders. Get them to qualify that. Now, certainly this all sounds very time consuming, but what hurts more, the time you're putting into this on the front end to create a more reliable position profile, or not having that buy-in, the lack of education, and then not using position profiles or using them and it's foreign to whoever's receiving them. And then you're getting pushback. And then what you have is you have hiring managers that are creating their own assessments. Then that just becomes messy all within itself, because then you have different gaps and different ways of solving those problems, or things that are deviating from what your expectations are as a gatekeeper around recruiting and selection. So why not get everybody on the same page when it comes to what these roles, responsibilities, and expectations look like as they're aligned with AcuMax drives? And I would even encourage, even though I didn't talk too much about it in this webinar, I would even encourage, when that manager is going through and qualifying each drive as it's aligned with each task, is having your AcuMax index database open and asking that manager, who do you think does a good job in this role that kind of shows you what your expectations and priorities are? They give you a name, you go into the database, you bring that up. So then what you're doing is you're creating visual reference. So here's Maurice Clooney's a 100%. Wow, Maurice is looks to very similar to somebody that's currently doing a good job. Could be in a different position, could be a CSR, but the reality is you're creating visual reference there, because every manager wants to duplicate and wants to clone that top performer. You have the data in front of you, and you have the functionality within the application to find like profiles. Let's take this position profile or Maurice's profile and let's do a search on like profiles. And then you bring up 10 people that's already in a company and you start to say, geez, this is going to help us clone some of these top performers. And that's another way of getting that buy-in. But you want it to be inclusive. Now, part of this is also education, additional education around AcuMax Index, requiring inclusive creation and approval. Now, I'm noticing some organizations that we work with are doing this, where the performance and culture team or the human resources team or the recruiting team will literally tell that any job request that you have, any job opening, this is the process that's required before we even start posting or interviewing that job. You have to follow through on this process. You have to contribute to the position profile if you are using the subjective position profile methodology. Otherwise, we don't start our search. Now, I know that seems like a tall order, somewhat harsh, but they're experiencing some positive reaction from that. But where this again starts is once they start to understand and have more visualization around how those drives are assigned to each task, that within itself sparks a lot of the buy-in. And then finally, reach out to us, right? We use us, your consultant, to come out and do a refresher course, provide more education. We also have a workshop where we are doing that with you, where we're taking your roles, responsibilities, and expectations for every job, helping you assign AcuMax Index drives to them. Becomes a very insightful dialogue around that in small groups. And then you have position profiles that are reflective of an inclusive contribution to that target. And then we also understand a little bit more on what we can anticipate when it comes to any types of gaps that we're going to encounter between the target profile and an applicant's profile. Happy to hear your questions. Also happy to work with you on implementing this within your organization. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.